welcome everyone to today's webinar. As I said, I'm Topher Buck. I'm the IC2 project manager here at NUMOA. We're really happy to have folks from Oregon Metro presenting today on the insights they've gleaned from the toxics reduction and equity study that Metro has been working on for quite some time and published in this last summer. I'm just going to cover a few kind of logistical items to get us started and then hand the presentation off. Excuse me. So, some just basic logistics as is typical for these kinds of things. All the attendee lines are muted during the presentation so that we can keep sound quality as good as possible. If you're familiar with the GoToWebinar interface, you know that there is a question interface as well as a chat interface. So if you're having issues or you have questions for the presenters, you can use those. In general, if possible, questions related to the presentation and the content, please use the question interface and keep the chat for technical questions or other things like that. But I understand that from time to time, questions related to the content will slip into the chat, and that's okay too. Scott and Farah are going to talk for approximately 40 minutes, so we'll have 15 to 20 minutes for Q&A and discussion afterward. I will generally, if I can, unmute. If you let me know through the question box that you have a question, I will at least try and unmute you so you can simply ask the question yourself. That's not always possible for whatever reason, and if it doesn't work, I will read the question for you. But that often is a nice way to get a little more engagement in these conversations. We are going to record this webinar. In fact, we are recording the webinar, so keep that in mind when commenting or asking questions. And the slides and information about the presentation will be available on the IC2 website in the days or weeks following the presentation, and you can find that at theic2.org/events. And finally, I just want to remind you that we really do care about the feedback that we get from all of you from these webinars. So please do take the post-webinar survey if you can. It helps us plan for the future. So presenters today, I'm not going to read these bios. You've presumably all gotten them and may have read them while I've been talking. But we're really pleased to have Scott Clegg and Farah Fatemi from Oregon Metro presenting to us today. And I want to welcome and thank Scott and Farah for taking the time to do this. And I just, as always, want to remind everybody that the IC2 training work group, is constantly working to come up with webinar topics and speakers of interest, and they really do we value your input. So if you have ideas or suggestions, please do let me know or let us know. So without further ado, let me give the presentation controls over to Farah, and we'll get started.
Hi, so this is Scott, and I'll be taking the first little part, and then Sarah will come in. Introduce yourself, Sarah.
I'm Farah. I'm an education specialist at Metro, and I'll be talking about the consumer product reviews part of the toxics equity study.
And I would like to acknowledge the authors of this study, and Carl Grimm, who is on a sabbatical here at Metro, I'm sort of stepping in for. So over time, he may have questions when he comes back later next year that you can address him specifically, as well as Monica Cuneo, who helped work on this study. So quickly, for those of you that don't know much about Oregon, just a couple, or Metro, just a couple little words on that. We're a state out here on the West Coast of about 4 million residents, 36 counties. I bring that up because the population is very much concentrated in the valley, but we do try and do in things like toxics and product stewardship and that I work on, we try and take the whole state into account. Metro itself is an elected regional government. We have about 1.6 million residents in the urban portions of the 3 counties. We run a variety of functions. The convention center, we manage the urban growth boundary, UGB, and the solid waste side of things. We have our own couple transfer stations, and we regulate other facilities in the region. In terms of why we care about toxics and equity, a couple high-level points from some of the policy documents. We're recognized as the steward of the region's waste stream. That includes household hazardous waste. That's often our entree into talking about toxics issues. Our council does have a set of desired outcomes or goals, which include clean air and water and healthy ecosystems. So oftentimes when we make requests to engage in things, we have to refer back to basic council. I don't know what are the agencies many of you folks work in, but that's very important around here. Also, the council has committed to equity goals of late very strongly, and the way this is expressed, for example, is we're committed to ensuring all people in the region have the opportunity to thrive regardless of their background. So that at a high level is where some of why we're coming at this study. In terms of the presentation, there's a lot of material in this report. Hopefully you all have links to it, or if you don't, we will make sure you get a link to it. We're going to, in the presentation, I'll talk a little briefly about the origins, purpose, and some of the major policy elements in the plan. Farah will go over some of the consumer products reviews, and then we'll talk a little bit, hopefully get some interaction when we talk about going forward from here. What are the opportunities for collaboration and joint action on things? In terms of the origins of the study, as I mentioned, HHW programs and our education efforts in that area are really sort of our touchstone for why we care about toxics reduction. We have healthy homes programs that talk about alternative to pesticides and other kinds of actions that we can take to reduce the toxicity of the product stream and the waste stream. We have been, over the past decade or more that I've been working on policy and legislative issues, have engaged in a number of things. The Oregon Chemicals Roundtable, for example, is one of the folks that helped set up the IC2, for example, as well as we have a Toxics Free Kids Act that passed several years ago that we worked on and tried to help get passed. When we talk about the study and why we had it, we were entering, this study got started just about the time when we were doing the groundwork for our new 2030 regional waste plan. It was an update of the previous regional solid waste management plan. And also, it was just, had become apparent that we needed to be able to have a good document to tell our counselors why we care about these particular issues, so that we can not just say that, oh, well, that's a nice thing, that's an environmental issue, we're all environmentalists, we should support that, but we wanted to link it to a specific legislative agenda. So the way we work around here is that when things come up during the year, or excuse me, during the legislative session, we talk about with them beforehand with council, and then if council agrees that's an important issue, we would have our lobbyists spend time down in the Capitol arguing for that bill. In terms of the specific purposes of the study, and what you'll find in it is we try to come up with something that provides a background on really the web of chemical policy regulations. Also to give people a little primer on products and chemicals, as well as what's been going on with the chemical policy reform movement of the past almost couple decades now. We also, in developing the study, wanted to apply an equity perspective to toxics issues. That had been developing over time, but we wanted to take a much closer look at what that meant. And And we wanted to see in particular, like I say, we had been doing studies and others had been doing work in the region that talked about impacts on vulnerable populations, but we wanted to really extend that out and unpack that quite a bit more. Also, the regional waste plan has the way it's constructed is in a series of action steps that will be taken, and we wanted to make sure that all the action steps that were recommended by the plan had an equity perspective, in particular the toxics, things that had to do with toxics. And as I said, the document, and we'll see when we get to the end, talk about the actions. It provides us a base for where Metro can get involved and support things. In terms of the organization of the report, it's a kind of a lengthy document. I'll be going over the first three issues here, three parts of the study here that are highlighted in yellow. Farah will work then to describe some of what's in the consumer products review. That's a huge hunk of the report. She'll go over a number of the product reviews in there, not all of them, and then we'll kind of wind up with talking about sort of the context of regulatory issues and opportunities for action going forward. In terms of the key policy elements of the plan, they're really, from a high level, we can talk about there's the chemical policies and chemical policy reform aspects to the document, as well as the equity framework, in which there's a cumulative risk component to the policy and targeted individualism. I will come back to those in just a moment. On chemical policies, this is something that Jennifer Allen, who wrote some materials that you may be familiar with, and they are nicely referenced in the study, talked about chemicals policy as being one of the classic wicked problems. That is something that resists simple solutions because of its complexity. And she recommended, and the report also adopts that, which is to take a systems approach to examine, all the underlying, the root causes, the structures, and how to tackle such complicated issues. In terms of the regulatory context, this is just a list of some of the things that are talked about in the report. There's several layers at which you can look at these various acts that have been passed at the federal level. And just wading through that was a major reason to do this document, was to just provide a summary of those different regulatory structures that are out there and how to think about chemical policy issues given the complexity of the regulatory environment. What we found very useful is what the folks out of California, I believe Wilson and I can't remember the other person's name right now, in the report, the framing of the problem is having three major components that needed to be addressed if you're going to reform chemical policy and the fragmented regulatory framework work to address the data gap, which is that much of the information that you need to know to make good policy is considered confidential, address the safety gap, that is that the government would lack the legal tools to take protective action in terms of the regulatory schemes, and the technology gap, which is a way of saying we need more green chemistry to deal with alternative kinds of substances that could be put in products instead of the hazardous ones. These were originally developed and worked on in order to address Taska reform, but there are still definitely areas where these need to be addressed. We saw just introduced last week in Oregon a new initiative to talk about some air toxics issues, and the data gap was right out there at the top. One of the things they want to do is to eliminate some of the proprietary data restrictions that currently apply to industrial sources. In terms of chemical policy reform, by 2016, we'd seen several things happen, and you can go to the report and kind of see some review of these. The states had stepped up in order to try and fill some of the gaps and to drive federal reform. These included things as product bans, support for green chemistry support. The Oregon governors, the executive did some work in that area and some initiatives there, as well as setting the stage for going forward with things like alternative assessments. Also, you may be familiar with, the Lautenberg Act of 2016, which did update Taska after more than 40 years. Not everything is perfect about that, but it certainly has a better risk-based standard. It introduces and puts in law the concept of susceptible subpopulations. It's a review of all chemicals, and it has some more secure funding. There are some good overviews in the report on this, as well as some background on how Taska update took place. Going forward, those of you that are familiar with the Taska update know that it's something that's going to have to be very closely watched given the current administration and its interest or lack thereof in certain aspects of the Act. It wasn't perfect to begin with, so it has to be very closely watched how implementation is going to go. And so the role of states has not concluded. It's going to have to continue. There's an ongoing need to close the safety and data gaps. Programs like Oregon and others in Washington, and you folks are aware of those in other states back in the Midwest and the East. So those need to be watched and implemented. Also, the idea of reframing the whole idea of chemical policy from risk reduction, taking it from exposure control to reducing inherent hazards is what we're seeing, as well as building a chemical industry to supply low or no hazard substances. In this report, you'll find it relies and would point you to Ken Geiser's work out of Massachusetts. He's really got some good write-ups. Some of the work references back to his stuff, so I'd highly recommend reading his most recent books or his presentations. In terms of the equity framework, to be at a high level here, when we looked at this, Monica, who worked on the report, brought this forward, and the two critical aspects of this framework are to take things as to look at things as a cumulative risk. That is, that the compound effects on health from both chemical and non-chemical stressors to individuals and a community. This is really something that we believe is going to kind of set the framework for chemicals impacts and toxicity studies. And going forward, it's at its early stages. It's very difficult to even do work, as you may know, on single chemicals, let alone to go to multiple chemicals, as well as the environmental aspects of it. Is really going to take many years to kind of develop a good literature. Although there's much out there now, making this the predominant framework in which people look at problems is going to take much effort. Targeted universalism, that's the concept of when you're working toward a goal for the whole community. You want to make sure that you address the special attentions of specific populations within that group, communities of color, vulnerable populations, young children, pregnant women, all sorts of groups, to make sure that when you're trying to get to this goal, that you recognize that some of those groups are going to have additional barriers, be it racism or discrimination of other sorts, that keep them from being able to get the resources necessary to address problems for them. And in terms of that, you can the report does talk about, and Farah will talk about in looking at individual products, that these are the frames you also want to look through in terms of the structural barriers that I mentioned, in terms of how resources don't get to certain populations because of discrimination or income status and things like that, as well as there's a strong, in our work at Metro, there's a strong racial equity component. This is a definition that's taken from our new strategic plan to advance racial equity, diversity, and inclusion, the definition that we use going forward. As well as all these things don't matter in terms of the research you do unless you make sure you include in your initiatives a way to address meaningfully the communities that are impacted and how to engage them. So here's an example of an EPA diagram from a number of years ago that looks at the environmental, takes that sort of cumulative risk-based model and describes what are all the different elements of it. So as I said, this is a complex problem, and over the next years, expect to see a lot more research that delves into these kinds of aspects of toxics issues. So I'm going to turn it over to Farah at this point, and she's going to go over several of the pieces of work that we did on individual products.
Great. So in the consumer product reviews, there's over 100 pages on some of the chemicals of concern and health impacts of those chemicals. So I really encourage you to check out the document if you want to know more about these different groups of products. But I'm going to touch on the ones that are bolded here and just highlight a few cases of some of the types of equity concerns that were coming up from the study. And I want to just quickly go over again, who are we focusing on when we are talking about increasing equity and achieving targeted universalism like Scott mentioned? Well, really we're looking at folks that are experiencing other stressors in their lives that will basically impact their ability to respond to chemical stressors. So low-income folks, workers that are exposed in the workplace. It turns out that more than 20% of the workforce is exposed to hazardous products at work, as well as pregnant mothers, people of color, and children. All of these are vulnerable populations. Okay, so I'm going to highlight some of the concerns raised in apparel. And again, this is just a small piece of what is in the study. And I am not an expert on all of the things that I mentioned, but these are just some highlights from the study. So textile workers are often low wage, and in the U.S., the workforce in textile industry is about 50% people of color. So people that are oftentimes experiencing racism and other stressors in their lives. Now, one problem is these azo dyes that are used in textiles, and they are used for cotton, silk, wool, as well as synthetic fibers. They're easy to use, they're relatively cheap, and they provide these clear and strong colors. The problem is that these are water soluble and really easy for the body to absorb, either by skin contact or inhalation or swallowing of dust. So the workers that are working with these dyes are exposed to some of the carcinogenic aromatic amines that are released as those dyes degrade, but also folks that are buying the products with dyes, those dyes degrade as people are wearing them or sleeping in garments that are dyed with these azo dyes. Another issue is solvents that are used in the textile industry. Dimethyl formamid, for instance, is a solvent used in textile production facilities, particularly acrylic, fiber spinning, and textile dyes and pigments. It has a whole range of health issues associated with it, but some of those include some pretty strong liver toxicity, as well as possible links to testicular cancer as well. So again, another real issue for the folks that are working in the industry and using those solvents. Now, I know that some of the IC2 folks are working on perfluorinated chemicals, and that's another major area of concern in apparel. These are obviously applied for stain resistance and water repellence in apparel, as well as things like tablecloths, shoes, tents, and so forth. Perfluorinated chemicals also have a host of health concerns, including just general immune system function, as well as decreased birth weights, lowering a chance of women's chance of getting pregnant, as well as things like even high cholesterol, as well as elevated blood pressure during pregnancy and thyroid dysfunction. So when we're thinking about regulations for perfluorinated chemicals, we should be thinking about these vulnerable populations as well as the people that are working in the industry. So a recent review of cancer risk in the textile industry found that workers in various job categories are really at higher risk of developing cancer because of some of the things that I just mentioned. So when we are thinking about policies, we really need to be thinking about how can we protect some of those workers as well. And there needs to be more work done around exactly who's at risk and how can we help them. All right, so I'm going to touch on cleaning products, which I also know that some of the IC2 folks have been working on. But when we are talking about cleaning products and their health impacts, we are particularly concerned about women and children, but that is because women are reporting as much as 80% of the household cleaning, and they are also making up the vast majority of the cleaning workforce as maids and household cleaners. Some of the major chemicals of concern, and there are a whole host of ones that I'm not mentioning here, include VOCs, non-phenol compounds, fragrances, which are a broad category of chemicals of concern, as well as triclosan. Now, when we look at cleaning products and their health impacts, occupational cleaning is a big concern, but some of the research in Europe has looked at long-term effects of occupational cleaning, and they found that over the course of a decade, the effects of occupational cleaning can be similar to smoking a pack of cigarettes a day, which is pretty amazing. So we really need to be thinking about how can we protect these workers. Now, in addition to that, asthma rates and reduced heart rate variability have been associated with use of spray cleaning agents for those in the cleaning industry, as well as people that are using them at home. And the children of cleaning workers are also born with higher rates of cleft palates and Down syndrome, which may be linked to the high use of toxics in those industries. It comes as no surprise, for children, the health risks are also increased rates of wheezing, asthma, and rhinitis, and this is supported in the research, particularly for homes that are using high rates of toxic cleaners or have high concentrations of VOCs. Babies exposed to air fresheners in the home have also experienced more ear infections, as well as increased rates of diarrhea. So some important health impacts for children associated with these cleaning products. Now, one thing that I want to point out is that there's a really interesting body of research that is coming out about how indoor air quality not only affects the air that we breathe inside, but also affects outdoor air quality. So this is from a study that came out in Science last year, looking at the impacts of volatile chemical products on air pollution in Los Angeles. And you can see that almost 40% of the contribution here is from consumer volatile chemical products that are largely used at home. So those are things like cleaners, paints, pesticides, but also things like personal care products, which I will talk about next. But again, just want to reinforce that we're learning more and more about indoor air quality and its impacts as well on outdoor air quality. So I just mentioned personal care products. as a category of concern. But again, as far as the equity concerns, we're really looking at women that are particularly vulnerable here, that are regularly using makeup, as well as adolescents, as well as professionals in the hair and nail care industry. So as far as personal care products, women of color are really at higher risk here, and that is because women of color are oftentimes buying more products. So African American consumers are purchasing 9 times more ethnic hair and beauty products than other groups, and they are disproportionately purchasing hair relaxers and straighteners, which can be quite toxic. Studies have also found that African American women experience higher exposures to phthalates from personal care products than white women. So if you combine the fact that they are using more of these products, that means they're exposed to more chemicals. They're also experiencing the effects of systemic racism in our country, which means that their cumulative health risk is much higher. So how can we help lower that with policies? So other health risks from personal care products, I mentioned phthalates just a minute ago, but we have seen that phthalate exposure for children is also a concern. So for 3-year-olds that had elevated phthalate exposure, they were more likely to develop motor delays, certain behavioral problems, and mental development issues. The presence of phthalate metabolites have also been associated with increased pregnancy loss, as well as increased likelihood of breast cancer. So there are a whole range of issues, again, disproportionately affecting women and children. Finally, in this category, I just want to talk a little bit about hair care professionals and folks that are working in salons. It turns out that 85 to 95% of these personal appearance workers are female, and almost a third of those are African American, Asian, and Latinx. So a lot of people of color working in this industry, a lot of people that are regularly using chemicals that are quite toxic. Okay, finally, I'm just going to touch really briefly on children's products, and Scott may or may not talk more about the Toxic Free Kids Act that was passed in Oregon, but some of the problematic chemicals in children's products are listed here, as well as the health concerns. There are many more than are listed here, but these are some of the main ones: bisphenols, phthalates, lead, and cadmium. And as you can see on the right, there's a whole range of health concerns that are associated with the presence of those chemicals in those products. One thing I want to bring up here is that the issue of exposure for children, particularly in low-income households, is exacerbated by product quality. So for folks that are shopping at dollar stores, it turns out that 40% of the customer base for dollar stores has an income less than $25,000 a year. So a really important customer base for them is low-income folks. In a recent study that looked at a wide range of dollar stores across the U.S., 81% of products had at least one hazardous chemical above levels of concern. So again, exposures for children are exacerbated by some of these socioeconomic factors. And I want to drive home that all of the risks that I talk about today in these consumer products are compounded by other things that folks are experiencing. Perhaps it's poor housing quality or other life stressors. So we need to be thinking holistically about legislation and policies that can address these cumulative health risks. The consumer product section touches on a lot of other areas like building materials, single-use containers, and so forth, and I encourage you to check out those areas as well for more information about health concerns and equity for other products. And I will pass it over to Scott, who I think maybe will lead discussion or questions.
Thank you, Farah. That was very helpful. Like we're saying this, we all want you to dive into the report, and particularly all these different areas. We can only give just sort of highlights today, so we look at this report study, as a resource. One of the things that is apparent in this field is that just the complexity of the regulatory structure and how you relate the regulations, the web of them out there, to the individual product areas is really a source of difficulty. This report makes a couple shots at that at a couple points where it talks about some of the deficiencies in the regulatory structure and how that is particularly prevalent in one of these particular product areas. But that's really, much of that work is sort of to be done, is to try and figure out, okay, these are these health risks in these areas. How do we construct a plan of action, either in the state, locality, or at the national level, to deal with these? I mean, I think people wanted to see Taska reform as really providing that one of the ways out of the old whack-a-mole single chemical perspective that we're on. But I don't think we're there yet. So I think that this report should provide a lot of good material to build some new strategies going forward. So the second bullet here on the opportunities for actions, there is a summary of the work that was done with regarding talking to a variety of stakeholders from the academic, the government communities. Talk a little bit more about that in a second, but that's laid out and summarized in the appendix, and recommend that you kind of dive into that. One of the things about working in this area, everybody has a little different perspective, people in industry, people that are working on the legislative side. So really trying to understand everybody's different perspective is very helpful. This report also references the specific work that Metro has done for our new 2030 regional waste plan. We've identified some specific actions both at the local and the state level, as well as talking about the need to act collaboratively with other governments and stakeholders going forward. In terms of the stakeholder perspectives, what came out of the work that was done was sort of saying that the highlights here is that there are advocates in the NGO community in that can act as catalysts, researchers that can serve as supporters and innovators for new policies, and the government regulators and the industry as innovator and actually the maker of products. So the stakeholder section kind of tries to sort through how can we initiate some actions when you've got these kinds of diverse kinds of stakeholders. In terms of the stakeholder reviews or the stakeholder discussions that were held, these four areas came out of the work that was done there, that there's still a data gap, there's a funding and resource gap, and importantly, there's this alignment on how we talk about things, strategically communicate, as well as the need to expand, everybody talking about an equity focus. In terms of opportunities for actions, I'll go over these quickly. You can read them in the report yourself. 3 different areas on policies, on research, and on collaboration. In terms of the policies and programs, these should be seen through an equity perspective, as we talked about. So specifically, Metro is identified for itself, continuing to work on chemicals of concern, implementation of the Toxic Free Kids Act, which is still in the rulemaking process in Oregon, working on green chemistry, product stewardship legislation, extended producer responsibility legislation, where it involves toxic products, as well as looking at our interest long-term over the years has been in C&D work, construction and demolition, and so developing more toxic-free building materials and legislation around that is important to our agency. In terms of research education, advancing research and education, product testing came out of the work on the plan that was done. People are interested in still seeing more about that. That relates to the Toxic Free Kids Act also. Tracking the variety of and the extreme amount of health research that is out there. Things like that have been done on the product profiles that have been done. That work doesn't stop. Those reviews that we have are really just a snapshot of today, so we need to keep doing that. Biomonitoring is something that has been of interest to several NGOs and others in the state, so we want to keep looking at that, pursuing that. Green chemistry, and then again, education, being strategic and aligning your messages with other folks. Finally, and most relevant to this group is how do we identify common priorities and goals going forward? We want it to continue, and it's in our plan that we're going to continue to support IC2, but we want to address issues with a common framework, that is the equity lens, and as I said, align the communications. I'm not, haven't worked closely with IC2, maybe Farah has a little more, but we do understand, my understanding is that of the things that you have that involve Metro and people working together, you have identified a strategic framework, you have these meetings and webinars, you have the chemicals data system, and coordinate around other legislation. So just to kind of wrap up here and try and have a couple minutes for questions here. I'm not as familiar with how people on this call set agency priorities, so that how can we, IC2 and other folks, identify mutual priorities and advance collaboration on several areas. So Farah has something to add. We'll hear from her, but then we perhaps open it up for questions. Did you have anything else that you...
I'll just add that, we do need more research on the topic as well. The equity study does a good job at trying to look at how vulnerable populations are impacted by toxics, but a lot of what's there is also just general impacts on, the general population. So we need more research on the topic as well, which Scott said, but I just want to emphasize. Well, I think with that, we will take any questions if folks want to talk about, what are you doing in your agencies? What are you concerned about? And maybe thinking and brainstorming ways that we can address some of these issues.
Well, great. First of all, thank you again, Scott and Farah. So I've gotten, one question to start through the question interface from Terry here at NUMOA, and I'm going to try and unmute Terry's line so she can ask the question. But again, if you have a question or a comment that you want to make through the question interface, you can do that. If you know how to raise your hand virtually through GoToWebinar, you could also do that as a way of signaling to me that you would like to make a comment or ask a question. But let me see if I can unmute Terry. So I think, Terry, you should have the line.
Thanks, Topher. Can you hear me?
Yes.
So I was reading this morning a piece in the New York Times. It was on the front page of the Times, and it's an announcement, or it's a article covering, I guess, an announcement by EPA that they're proposing to only consider studies where they can identify all the participants and get into all their confidential health records as part of the health, the study on particularly health effects. And, you all highlighted data gaps as really important, and I think you're right, data gaps are really important. I guess I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about this announcement by EPA, because it sounds like they're not going to be willing to take a lot of health studies that guarantee confidentiality to the participants in the studies, which has, been a long-standing practice by health researchers. And I guess I'm pretty concerned about what impact that's going to have on efforts like what you're describing and lots of other efforts that we undertake.
Yeah, I was gobsmacked by that one. I saw that popped up on my phone last night. I said, "Oh my God!" Yes, in the name of in the name of sound science, they recommend throwing out all that, protected personal information. I don't know. This is an example of the field of chemicals policy is so broad that I don't know who would take up on action. Is anybody else on the line? It would be nice to know whose bailiwick does this fall into in terms of who might take exception to this, sue, whatever actions. I don't know if this is a revision of the rulemaking. I would assume that this have to follow some course of action that could be appealed. But yeah, it seems it rocked me back on my heels to think about all the stuff that would have, because they were saying you could go back and upend, Terry, if I recall the article, that you could go back and upend existing regulations. It's not just going forward.
That's what the article says. And it just seems to me a lot of the research underpinnings, of the kind of health research that you all cited, at least the human aspects of those studies, the epidemiological studies, that kind of thing, they all depend on, data from people that they are unlikely to provide unless they can be guaranteed confidentiality. Otherwise, their health information could be, accessed by a lot of people. So it is, yeah.
Did they quote anybody else?
Well, apparently they did get 600,000 comments on this, or some astronomical number like that. And apparently they ignored, all the major health organizations and various environmental groups, and all the commenters who said, who were critical of this direction at EPA in their first go round on this proposal. And they, from the first proposal to the second proposal, they've expanded, what the sort of direction that this would take. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, one thought I have is that I think that's a real huge issue. With some of our work, we work with communities that, we want to compensate sometimes. They have to fill out W-9s and they don't want to because they, maybe they're not documented. So we work a lot with community-based organizations and partner with them sometimes to accomplish things as a workaround. And maybe that is something that needs to be done as well, is really working with nonprofits and community organizations to work with some of these communities. I don't know if that would, be permissible by EPA, but as a broader strategy, maybe.
So does IC2, I would think, have a strong interest in this because you're data mavens, so to speak, and talking about and has a certain amount of, I would think, credibility in the community on this, and would be curious as to whether this might be an opportunity for folks to do a sign-on letter, or I don't know if, Terry, if you're saying that this has been out for comment for a while, I don't know, kind of quiet. This is the first I'd heard of it. So, and that's something about, there's communication within the chemical policies community sometimes is difficult because it's so broad. But I'd be curious as to whether IC2 or others would want to step up and comment and work on this, and how just sort of an open question how this organization, IC2, might act on this. I don't know whether it's just provide technical expertise as opposed to advocacy. I don't know where you folks might come down on that.
Well, I think that's a great question, Scott. So I tell you what, I've got a couple of other sort of questions, and I mean, so one of these speakers may get to that. So I think first, Holly Davies at the Washington Department of Health. Holly, I unmuted you, so if you want to go ahead and speak up.
Thanks, Topher. I was going to address the article. A lot of the points were made that I was going to make. Moving forward, I think the best thing to do would be to work together as states to make comments. I think it's stronger if it's coming from a coalition, like in the past when comments have been made through the attorney generals, where everyone got together and made kind of one statement. Although, as was mentioned, the 600,000 comments seem to have been ignored, and the new proposed rule is worse than the other proposed rule. So I don't know how effective it will be, but I think that's the most effective way. Everyone keeps mentioning, the six cities study and the air quality, because it's going to be retroactive, as a good example. I think everyone kind of came to that. That is the example to mention. That would be my most constructive way of moving forward.
Great, thanks, Holly. Okay, let's see. Carl Palmer, I see you have a question. Let me see if I can unmute you. So I think you have the floor, Carl.
Thanks, Topher. Can you hear me?
Yes, not exceptionally well, but we can hear you.
Okay, yeah. My question is, really, has been considered regulatory action to things at the local level on specific products?
Nope, Carl, can't hear you.
Can't hear me.
Yeah, sorry, Carl, you're breaking up. It may be easier for me to read your question. I'm sorry.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Okay, yeah. So the question that Carl answered through the question box was sort of straightforward. Does Metro see a potential action to regulate any products at the local level?
Good question. One of our restrictions, we were looking at doing an EPR, producer responsibility bill, on like household hazardous waste, but we're preempted on pesticides. There's one of those awful little state bills that says pesticides, the use and the distribution, can only be regulated at the state level. So we have looked at that and thought about that in the past. I think that we're just getting into some of this. So some of the, we are looking at product bans, and there might be something with regards to, some of the, the food containers, PFAS and food containers in that. We'd be at a really early stage on that, but one of the things that we do is we look at what other folks are doing. So to the degree that we try and follow, but it's difficult, we try and follow what other jurisdictions are doing. So more on the recycling side, we've been looking at, well, what did, some cities down in California do on that, on a particular, single-use plastic. In terms of focusing on particular products with hazards, I think there's a willingness to do that. And I think like I say, we still have to do the work of prioritizing and seeing what other people are doing and where's there some consensus that would be a good thing to work on. Because the point of doing individual product bans is to spur, at least in my view, is to spur action at the state and or the federal level. So you want to pick something that could be supported and that would hopefully lead to, substantive action at higher levels. Other questions?
Well, yeah. So this is Topher. I was just going to follow up on that. Do you do you at Metro, for example, and perhaps the IC2 is that venue, or at least one of the venues, how much opportunity do you have to talk with colleagues in other metro areas, whether they are, other metro areas within Oregon, or, I'm thinking, of course, of, IC2 supporting members like King County and San Francisco, that, right, are presumably facing many of the same questions and challenges that you are. Do you have much opportunity to collaborate with colleagues in other municipalities?
A couple things. I think we would like to look to IC2 as a way to coordinate and share information, as well as even advance some advocacy stuff. We have the Oregon Chemicals Roundtable was a way to get to some of that. That's DEQ's been shifting some of their priorities, so I think people here have to figure out where to go with that group. But that had been one where things like that had been worked on. And then there is NAMA, for some other issues. But I think I would, hopefully this report can help stir a new round of figuring out what the best way to collaborate is. Because it takes resources to do this. It takes people's time, and some of the specific stuff, like keeping track of, the Toxic Kids Act and, commenting on the rules. That's a major investment in itself. So hopefully not hopefully, but our plan does recognize that as an issue, and hopefully, we're here today because of that, and wanting to share. So there will be an ongoing effort to try and figure that out, and we'd be very interested in, at a regional or national level, how to, so you could just turn to someone and say, oh, we need to crank out an announcement and get a sign in on a rulemaking stuff. It's often very difficult and part of the reason we did this report was that we just don't always go up to our electeds and say, we need you to sign on to this letter. We don't have to explain it. Hopefully this gives us a foundation that they would go, oh, another one, sure, here we go.
Right. Great. Well, we're just about out of time, but there's one comment from Carl Grimm, and I'm going to at least try and unmute Carl and let him make his comment before we sign off. So, Carl, you want to give it a shot?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
You're so far away, though.
Yeah, I am. I'm in France. And I just wanted to shout out to Farah and Scott. Thank you so much for the great presentation. And particularly also to thank, sorry for the noise in the background here, to thank all the IC2 members who have helped with the study, either as stakeholder interviewees or peer reviewers. Diane, Jen, Ken, Topher, Nancy, Kevin, Lisa, Justin, and Carl. All of you have helped, and I may have forgotten anyone. If I did, I'm sorry. And I just wanted to say thank you to everyone who's working on this, not just the study, but also the work that it describes and the work of the IC2. I'm just so happy and pleased with all of what's going on in terms of the efforts. And we've got a long way to go, obviously, and I think together we can do it. So thanks again.
Carl put a lot of blood, sweat, and tears into this report. So
I hope we did justice to your work here, Carl. Thank you so much.
Absolutely.
Great. Well, we are out of time, I'm afraid. So I just want to again thank Scott and Farah for presenting to us today. This is excellent, and definitely some really great food for thought. And as you've said, the study itself is a rich banquet, more information, and to kind of get us going. So certainly do encourage everybody to take a look at that study in depth. So again, thank you so much, everybody, for joining us today. Again, we've got another really great webinar a week from today, focused on fluorine-free alternatives to PFAS in firefighting foams. So if you are interested in that topic, please join us. It's going to be a wide-ranging discussion, both topically and geographically. We've got presenters from literally all over the world joining us, so we hope you can hope you can participate. So thanks again, and have a great day.
Thank you.